My name is Pratik Gandhi. I am a data and AI focused cloud solution architect working with Microsoft. I'm here to talk about the new automated high availability feature in Azure SQL Virtual Machines. This feature lets you easily set up high availability and disaster recovery on your SQL virtual machines using the well-known AlwaysOn technology. This feature can be used for high availability, disaster recovery, and read scalability scenarios. In order to set up HADR using the automated feature in SQL virtual machines, there are a few prerequisite steps that need to be finished. Let's look at those prerequisites. There are 3 steps that you need to finish before you can use this feature within Azure SQL virtual machines. Step 1 is to create an Active Directory domain. This Active Directory domain server or servers can be running on premises or in Azure. In majority of the scenarios, you can skip this step because I can assume that you already have an Active Directory domain server running on premises or in Azure. Second step is creating more than 2 SQL virtual machines that will be part of your high availability or disaster recovery configuration. Both the first step and the second step can be automated by using an ARM template. For the second step, this template can, we have an existing Azure template that can create n number of SQL VMs specified by a parameter in this template. And the last prerequisite is, once I created the Active Directory domain, once I created 2 or more VMs, the last step is to add these VMs to the domain. Again, this step can be automated using a template from the ARM gallery. Now I'm going to show you a demo of how to connect your existing SQL Server virtual machines that you created to an existing Active Directory domain. As you can see in this screen, I have 2 SQL Server virtual machines. And these SQL Server machines have the SQL IaaS extension enabled. So when I click on these SQL virtual machines, you see this high availability feature. As you can see, by default, this feature is turned off. For you to be able to turn this on, you have to meet the prerequisites. One of them is adding these 2 VMs to domain before I can use this feature. So let's go ahead and do that. Let me show you a quick preview of my virtual machines in my environments. I have 2 Active Directory domain servers, and I have these 2 SQL Server VMs. What I'm trying to do as a part of this video is showing you how to add these 2 VMs to the Active Directory domain. We will do this using existing ARM template. So let's start by searching for deploy custom template. And as you can see here, there is a bunch of quick start templates. We can start by doing a domain join. I will use this existing template 201 VM domain join existing. Select the template. Select appropriate resource group. Put the VM names. The VM names can be comma separated. So add all your VMs here. Provide your domain username. Now this username has to be administrator, domain administrator. Write the password. Provide the FQDN and hit create. I'm going to pause the video here and come back when these 2 SQL virtual machines are added to the domain. Okay, so both my SQL Server virtual machines have now successfully connected to the domain or been added to the domain. This step took about 1 minute and 50 seconds. Let's ensure by connecting to one of the VMs using a domain username and password and ensure that they are in fact connected to the domain. So I'm going to connect to MFG SQL VM1. Let's go ahead and connect to or RDP into the server. Let's go ahead and download the file and connect to the VM. While connecting, we will make sure to log in as a domain user and not as a local user. So I'm going to put my domain name. My domain name here is Contoso. Let's log in to our VM. Server Manager should open as soon as you log into the VM, and click on the local server. And if you see the domain with the domain name here, that ensures that your machine or your SQL virtual machine has successfully connected to the Active Directory domain. Now that we have the prerequisites set up, let's look at the process of setting up high availability on these two SQL Server virtual machines with the IaaS extension. There are two steps. Step one, create a failover cluster. Now this can be done using the automated GUI in the front end. Or if you prefer, and if you are a seasoned Windows admin, you can log into the SQL VMs and set up the failover cluster. Step two, once my cluster is ready, I create an always-on availability group, and as a part of the AOAG creation, I will also create a listener. Once my AOAG and listener is ready, I can start adding my existing databases to the always-on availability group that I created in the previous step. All right. So now that we've learned what are the steps needed to set up high availability, let's go ahead and implement that in our demo environment. As you can see here, I am in the VM01 and in the high availability interface. As you can see, the error is gone now. We still have a warning which says that you need to create a failover cluster before you configure your first always-on availability group. So I'm going to go ahead and create my first failover cluster. Now I'm going to go ahead and give it a name. Now, there's one thing that you need to be careful about over here. When you create a Windows failover cluster using this interface, it uses a storage account or cloud storage account as a witness. Now, one thing to realize here is to make sure that you either choose an existing storage account which is in the same resource group as the SQL VMs, or to make your life easy, create a brand new storage account, which is what I'm going to do. Make sure you add the 2 or more VMs that you want to be part of your cluster. Go ahead and hit apply. Now, I actually forgot to expand this section. We need to provide a SQL service account, which will be used to start your SQL server. As a best practice, what you want to do is make sure that you're using a service account which is not a domain administrator or a local administrator on your SQL VM. For the cluster credentials, we'll need to provide a account which has admin privileges on the server or both the servers in my scenario. So I'm going to do that. Let me copy paste. And I think we are good to go. Yes. So this might take a few minutes. I'm going to pause the video over here and come back when the cluster creation has completed. Okay, I'm back. The deployment for the failover clustering finished successfully. Let's go to the
SQL virtual machines and see how it looks. All right, so as you can see now, the warning here is gone. We are now able to go ahead and create an availability group. Before we do this, let's connect to one of the SQL virtual machines and make sure that we can see the cluster is set up correctly. So let's do that. Let's go to the one of the two virtual machines, remote desktop into the virtual machine. And when we log in, let's make sure that we log in with a domain account and not a local account. So in my case, it's corp is my domain name. So once it's here, what I'm going to do is bring on the failover cluster manager and validate that I can see both the nodes and everything seems set up correctly. Okay. So what I'm going to do is from the server manager pane, I'm going to turn on the failover cluster manager. And we'll, as you can see, my cluster is created. Let's make sure both the nodes are visible here. They are up and running. Everything looks great. Now, one thing to remember is this automated GUI does not run the failover cluster tests. So you might want to run the failover cluster tests before moving on to the next steps and make sure that the cluster is set up properly. Okay. So we have now completed the step of adding our existing servers or adding our two SQL VMs to a Windows failover cluster. The second last step here is to create a high availability. I'm sorry, to create a always on availability group. So let's go ahead and do that. Again, click on any one of the VMs, select high availability, and choose new always on availability group. Let's give our group a name. So I'm going to call it manufacturing databases. I'm going to add replicas. I'm going to add my two servers. I'm going to, so these are some important considerations. Do you want the failover to be automatic? So general best practice says set it for high availability, set them to be turned on. Make sure that the readable set secondaries are set to yes. If you want your secondary replica to be read, let's go ahead and hit apply. Now, one important step, optional but important, is configuring a listener. So let's go ahead and do that and specify a listener name. And we'll create a new load balancer. And let's go ahead and hit apply and apply. Okay. I'm going to come back in a few seconds or a few minutes once the availability group is created. Now, before I go, actually, one important thing to remember. Now, this step could potentially fail if your SQL VM's public IP address has a basics queue. So let me show you what I'm talking about. If I go on virtual machines, let's click on the first SQL virtual machine and go to the networking. And let's click on our public IP here. And let's look at the properties. As you can see, the property of my public IP here is standards queue. Now, there is a possibility that you chose basics queue when you created the virtual machine. In case that happens, you can always change this queue from basic to standard. And I'm going to share this link in the notes below. But this PowerShell script lets you convert your existing IP queue from basic to standard if need be. As I covered in the VM creation window, make sure that you set it properly at the time of the VM creation itself so you don't have to worry about this.
All right, I'm going to pause the video now and come back when the always on availability group creation has finished. Okay. So the always on group creation finished successfully. Took about 10 minutes. And now we are ready to add our existing databases to our always on availability group that we just created. So I'm going to remote desktop into the MFG01 server. Let's connect to it. Let's also try and connect to 02. See if it, yep, we are able to successfully connect to both the servers. Now let's expand always on. Now, as expected, you can see that the availability group and the listener that we created are both available, and we just need to create our databases and add them to this group. So let's go ahead and create MFG-1 and MFG-2. Add both these databases to the cluster. I'm sorry, to the availability group. So we can go ahead and right click, add database, add both our databases. So before you add a database to availability group, one of the requirements or prerequisites is that you need to take a full backup. So let's go ahead and take a full backup of both these databases. Okay, so now let's go ahead and run a couple of scripts that's going to create backups of these databases, the full backups that will then enable our databases to be added to always on availability groups. My backups are created. Let's now again try and add our databases to the availability group. As you can see, it meets the prereqs. I'm going to go ahead and add these databases to the VM. I'm going to stick with the defaults. This is a small database, so I can have the wizard finish the seeding for me. And as you can see, the two databases are now added to the dashboard. I can see everything looks green. Life is good. Now, if I want to connect, just to verify that the listener actually works, let's try and connect to the database where my using my AOAG listener. And there you go. Let's just make sure. As you can see, MFG01 is our primary. Let's do a failover. So we are going to fail over to server 2. Once the failover is done, as a test, what I'm going to do is I'm going to try and run this connection which I have to the listener, make sure it goes to 02 now, since 02 is the primary. Okay, it's taking a minute. I'm going to rerun the query and we should be good to go once the failover had finished. And as you can see, we are connected to VM02, so failover seems to be working fine. Always on availability group is configured properly and we are good to go.